They were told their enemies would chain them, starve them, and break them without mercy. But when the trucks stopped and the dust cleared, what waited in the Texas heat was not a battlefield, but something far more unsettling. The sun beat down on rows of wooden barracks, stretching across a plain of red earth wind, scraping against the barbed wire that surrounded it all. For men who had marched through ruin, this silence felt like mockery. They had been warned that capture meant humiliation, that death was honorable, and surrender a stain that could never be washed away. Yet here they were, stepping out of the back of a transport truck into a world that smelled not of blood, but of bread and machine oil, the scent of life itself. Their boots hit the dirt with the same rhythm as their racing hearts. Dust clung to their faces, sweat burned their eyes, but they refused to show weakness. They looked for the cruelty they had been promised, the jeering guards, the blows, the hunger. But what they found was order, routine, and faces that were unreadable. It was wrong, all of it. The enemy was supposed to be savage, and yet everything here looked clean, precise, almost civilized. One man whispered to another, barely moving his lips, wondering if this was some kind of deception, a slow trap, laid with kindness instead of guns. The thought cut through them like a blade. Was this mercy? Or was this the first stage of defeat? What kind of enemy disarms you not with pain but with decency? The engines rumbled into silence, leaving behind a heavy, unnatural quiet that pressed against their ears. The men sat frozen in the backs of the trucks, the metallic rattle of their chains replaced by the distant hum of cicadas and the slow creak of a windmill turning in the distance. When the order came out, they hesitated. It was not fear of the command itself, but of what might follow. They had expected shouts, blows, the sharp crack of rifle butts. None came. Only the hot wind and the crunch of boots as they climbed down one by one into the blinding Texas Sunday. The ground was dry and cracked, the color of rust. Barbed wire fences glinted in the light, slicing the horizon into perfect lines. Beyond them stood watchtowers and rows of barracks painted in dull army green. Smoke rose from somewhere behind the mess hall, carrying with it a smell they could not name. Something thick and savory, completely out of place in a prison. For a moment some of the men closed their eyes, thinking of home of kitchens that no longer existed. Then the shouts came again, crisp and firm, but not cruel. Form up, move forward. They obeyed without thinking. Obedience was the only thing left of their training. They lined up, heads down, their shadows long and thin against the dust. Guards stood at intervals along the path, rifles slung low but ready. Their faces were unreadable, neither angry nor kind, just watchful. One guard gestured sharply toward the barracks, and the line moved. The sound of boots scraping over gravel filled the air like static. Someone coughed. Another stumbled and quickly righted himself, terrified of drawing attention. But the guard closest to him didn't strike. He simply waited, eyes narrowed, until the man regained his balance. Inside, the compound order reigned. Trucks unloaded supplies. Smoke drifted from the chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet. It looked nothing like the chaos of war they had left behind. No craters, no blood, no screaming. Instead, there was symmetry, an eerie calm that made the hair on their necks stand up. They passed through a checkpoint where 2 American soldiers marked their names on a clipboard, the movements methodical, detached, as if processing goods, not men. At the next table, medics waited. The prisoners stared at the instruments laid out, thermometers, stethoscopes, clean bandages. A man with a bandaged leg tried to step past, thinking it was a trick, but the medic stopped him, gently motioned for him to sit. Without a word, he removed the old filthy wrappings and replaced them with clean gauze. The prisoner flinched at every touch, expecting pain, humiliation, anything. None came. The silence between them was unbearable. Further down the line, they were ordered to strip off their uniforms. Torn, lice-infested, soaked with months of sweat and mud, those rags were the last symbols of who they had been. Soldiers of the Reich, defenders of an empire now collapsing behind them. When a pile of new clothes was handed out, plain tan fabric, marked with large black letters, one of them stared at it for a long time before pulling it on. It was warm, too soft, too clean. It felt like betrayal just to wear it. The sun was still merciless, yet there was water here, real water. Metal barrels filled with cold, clear liquid stood beside the barracks. A guard motioned for them to drink. One man bent down, cupped his hands, and tasted it like a test. It was fresh, untouched by salt or filth. He drank again faster now, until a guard tapped the barrel with the butt of his rifle, not in anger, but to tell him, enough. The man wiped his mouth confused, half expecting to be punished for thirst. None came. The kindness stung more than cruelty ever could. By late afternoon they had been herded through registration, searched, and assigned bunks. The barracks smelled of pine and dust. Wooden frames lined both sides, each with a wool blanket folded neatly at the end. They touched the fabric as if afraid it would vanish. Outside, the wind moved through the wire fence with a low whistle that sounded almost like music. One man sat down heavily on his cot, elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards. "Is this a prison?" he muttered under his breath. No one answered. A loudspeaker crackled, announcing orders in English none of them understood. The guards moved with mechanical precision, guiding the prisoners without striking or shouting. There was power here, but not hatred, control without fury. It unnerved them more than open violence ever could. They had prepared for pain, for death, for the stripping away of dignity. But not for this. Not for silence and order and the faint smell of food drifting in from a kitchen somewhere nearby. As dusk fell, the horizon burned orange, and the camp lights flickered on, one by one. The prisoners gathered at the windows, staring at the fading sky. The same sun had set over battlefields filled with their dead, and yet here it went down peacefully. It was intolerable. Mercy itself felt like an accusation. A young soldier, barely 20, clenched his fists so hard his nails drew blood. "They want to break us this way," he whispered. "They make us live when we should already be dead." No one replied. The barracks were quiet, except for the sound of breathing and the creak of wood under shifting bodies. Somewhere outside, an American guard laughed at a joke, the sound distant and foreign. The prisoners lay down, still wearing their new uniforms, staring at the ceiling in the dim light. Every kindness they had seen that day cut deeper than any wound. As the last light faded, one thought lingered among them all. If this was captivity, then what did freedom mean? The enemy they had been taught to fear had offered them water, shelter, even care. The world they knew was gone, and this one strange, ordered, merciful waited like a mirror they did not want to face. The war outside still raged, but inside the wire another war had begun. One fought in silence between pride and survival, between what they believed and what they could no longer deny. Morning came with the sound of a bugle cutting through the still air, sharp and unfamiliar. For a moment the men didn't move. Some thought they were dreaming, others feared it was a call to punishment. But then the door burst open, and the guards barked short-clipped orders. The prisoners stumbled out into the light, squinting at the glare that poured over the compound. The cold had faded, replaced by the heavy heat of Texas, rising off the ground in waves. They stood in formation, boots sinking into dust, stomachs gnawing at emptiness that had become part of their bodies. Hunger was not new to them, it was as familiar as breathing. But what came next was... The guards didn't lead them to work, nor to a pit or punishment ground. Instead, the lines were directed toward a long wooden building at the center of the camp. The smell hit them first. Thick, greasy, warm. It drifted through the air like something forbidden, a scent so rich it almost hurt to breathe it in. The men exchanged wary looks, disbelief flickering behind hollow eyes. Some thought it was a trick, a test to see who would break first and reach for food that wasn't theirs. But the guards said nothing, only gestures forward. Keep moving. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Metal trays clanged, voices murmured, steam hissed from pots. The mess hall was larger than any room they had seen since the war began. Rows of benches filled the floor, and at the far end stood American cooks, behind a counter, sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on their forearms. The prisoners stopped short. For years they had been taught that Americans were monsters, undisciplined and brutal. Yet the men behind the counter moved with the precision of soldiers. No laughter, No mockery, just work. A guard nudged the first man forward. The prisoner approached the counter like he was walking to his execution. The cook reached into a tray, scooped something brown and sizzling, and dropped it onto a bun. The smell was intoxicating salt-fat, smoke meat. Then came a ladle of something golden and crisp, thin strips he didn't recognize, and finally a bottle glass cold covered in condensation. The red script on its label curled like art. He stared at it, unable to move. The guard motioned again. "Take it." He obeyed. The bottle was cold enough to sting his hand. He shuffled to a table, still not believing this was for him. Around him, the others received the same hot food, real food. The hiss of bottles being opened filled the air like static. One man lifted his to his lips and nearly choked as the fizz burst against his tongue, a shock of sweetness and fire. He coughed, eyes wide, gasping for air, but then he laughed, a raw, broken sound that startled everyone nearby. The guard watching frowned, confused, but said nothing. At another table, a man simply stared at the hamburger on his tray. He touched it with trembling fingers, half expecting it to vanish. When it didn't, he lifted it to his mouth. The first bite came with a rush of heat and grease that coated his tongue, a flavor so overwhelming it brought tears to his eyes. He chewed slowly, reverently, as if afraid to offend the food itself. A drop of fat ran down his chin and he wiped it away quickly, ashamed. Around him, others began to eat, the silence breaking into small, disbelieving murmurs. They had lived on watery rice, dried fish, and moldy bread for months. Here they were being fed like men, not prisoners. The realization hit like a blow. One whispered, "They mean to fatten us before we die." Another shook his head, whispering back, "No, they eat like this themselves." The idea was absurd, almost dangerous. To think that such abundance was normal, that the enemy lived with so much while their families starved back home, was unbearable. The Coca-Cola burned sweet in their throats, and the hamburgers filled the space where fear had lived. But the relief was poisoned by shame. For some, every bite felt like betrayal. They remembered the propaganda posters, the speeches promising honor in suffering, purity in hunger. And yet, here, in the heart of their enemy's land, the act of eating was tearing down years of belief. One man put his food down halfway through, staring at his reflection in the bottle's dark glass. "We were told they were animals," he murmured. "But animals don't feed their captives." When the meal was over, the guards ordered them to return to their barracks. No one spoke during the walk back. The sun was blinding now, heat rolling off the ground in shimmering waves. Inside the barracks, the men sat on their bunks, holding the bottles and wrappers like relics. A few couldn't finish what they'd been given, tucking scraps of bread under their mattresses, still ruled by habit and fear. Others just stared at their hands, as if seeing them for the first time. That night, silence filled the room. Some men prayed softly, others lay awake, their thoughts spinning. Kindness was harder to endure than pain. Pain could be resisted, defined, understood. But kindness, unasked for, undeserved, was disarming. It demanded they see the enemy as human. It stripped away the armor they had built inside themselves. As the lights dimmed, one of them whispered, "Maybe this is how they win. Not by killing us, but by making us doubt." No one answered, but the words stayed in the air, heavy and real. They had expected chains and found food, expected cruelty and found order. They had survived battlefields, hunger, and fire. But this was something else entirely. In the darkness, the scent of that meal still lingered, sweet and unbearable. It filled their lungs, their minds, their dreams, until even sleep became a reminder. They had been captured by their enemies, but what haunted them most was not defeat. It was the terrifying possibility that their captors, in feeding them, had shown them what being human actually meant. Days began to settle into rhythm, though no one dared to call it peace. The first mornings after the meal felt unreal, as if the camp itself existed outside the war. The bugle still sounded at dawn, sharp and precise, followed by roll call work assignments and the shuffle of boots in gravel. Yet beneath the mechanical order, something quieter was happening, something the men could not yet name. Hunger no longer ruled them. The constant dread had dulled. In its place came a new kind of unease, the uneasy calm of survival. The camp functioned like a small town wrapped in wire. Every day followed the same pattern: wake up, assemble, eat, work, eat again, rest, lights out. The rules were clear and enforced without cruelty. Guards patrolled in pairs, faces unreadable. The barracks were swept clean, beds made to regulation, inspections conducted without shouting. The rhythm was suffocating and strangely comforting. After years of chaos, predictability itself felt like an unfamiliar luxury. They were divided into work groups. Some were sent to clear brush along the fence lines, others to chop wood or repair roads outside the compound under armed escort. A few worked in nearby farms, where they saw American civilians for the first time: men in overalls, women in cotton dresses, children who stared at them with a mix of fear and fascination. The prisoners were paid in camp coupons for their labor, small slips of paper they could exchange for soap, cigarettes, or writing paper. The first time one of them received a bar of chocolate from the canteen, he held it for hours before eating it, as if it were a piece of treasure. In the evenings, when the sun sank and the wind cooled, the barracks came alive with low conversations, laughter muffled by exhaustion. Some men carved figures out of scrap wood, others drew in the dirt or mended clothes with scavenged thread. The walls slowly filled with small traces of life: folded letters, hand-drawn maps of home, even a rough calendar scratched into the planks. A guard once caught a man humming softly and didn't stop him. That small act spread like rumor music was allowed. The next night a few joined in quietly at first, until the faint tune carried through the barracks like something forbidden yet holy. Language became a bridge before anyone realized it. A few of the younger prisoners picked up English words from guards, shouting instructions: work, move, stop. Soon they began repeating them awkwardly to each other. One evening a guard tossed a ball toward a group during break. They hesitated, unsure if it was mockery, until he gestured again. "Play," he said. The ball rolled at their feet. One man bent, picked it up, and threw it back. The laughter that followed was brief, but real. For the first time since capture, it didn't sound like surrender. It sounded human. Small exchanges began to define their days. A guard might leave a pack of gum on a crate and walk away without looking back. The prisoners would take one piece each, chewing it carefully, amazed by the taste that never faded. Another guard shared a cigarette with a man after a long day of work, both standing in silence under the orange sky. No words were needed. The gesture was enough. Between captor and captive, understanding flickered, not friendship, not forgiveness, but something fragile and dangerous: recognition. But not all moments were gentle. Outside the fence, hostility lingered. Farmers, forced to host work details, glared at the prisoners with thinly veiled hatred. One man muttered curses, another spat on the ground as they passed. The guards rarely intervened, only tightened their grip on their rifles. The prisoners kept their eyes down, pretending not to hear. Later, back in camp, the story spread and anger simmered. "See," one man said bitterly, "they still hate us." His bunkmate answered quietly, "Wouldn't you if it were your home burned instead of theirs?" No one replied. The truth stung too sharply. Letters became lifelines. Each man was allowed to write twice a month, 2 letters and 4 postcards. The words had to pass through censors, but still they wrote. Some letters were filled with empty reassurances: "I am alive. I am treated fairly." Others carried desperate questions: "Are you safe? Is our home still standing?" When replies came, they were fragile. Things thin, paper, faint handwriting, sometimes stained with tears. A man once received a letter saying his wife and son had survived the bombings. He read it until the paper nearly tore his lips, trembling, whispering their names like a prayer. For the rest of the night he sat awake, the letter clutched in his hand, unable to sleep. Over time, faces softened. The haunted look that had defined them since capture began to fade, replaced by something quieter: fatigue mixed with endurance. They worked because work filled the hours. They obeyed because order made sense. But beneath that surface grew questions none dared to voice. Why were they treated this way? Why did the enemy feed them, clothe them, even allow them dignity? Some convinced themselves it was strategy, a show for the Red Cross, a manipulation. Others began to suspect it was something simpler, more unbearable: Maybe the enemy didn't see them as monsters after all. One evening during English class organized by the camp, a guard drew the word family on a chalkboard and asked for a volunteer. A young prisoner stood hesitated, then said it aloud, "Fam-lee." The sound was awkward, broken, but it made the others smile. Even the guard smiled. The man sat down, cheeks burning, unsure if it was pride or shame. That night he dreamed of his own family, their faces blurred by time and smoke, and woke with tears he refused to wipe away. The camp became its own strange world, governed by schedules, fences, and a rhythm that dulled the edges of fear. In that repetition, the men began to rediscover fragments of themselves. The parts that had existed before the war turned them into instruments of destruction. The sound of laughter no longer startled them. The taste of food no longer felt like a crime. And yet beneath that fragile normalcy, guilt gnawed at them. How could they live well while their homeland burned? How could they laugh while others starved? The irony was cruel. Captivity had given them stability, while freedom had destroyed everything they loved. Each sunrise carried the same contradiction. They woke under guard but alive, safe inside the very country they had been told was barbaric. The world had flipped and they were left standing on its underside. At night, when the lights dimmed and silence took hold, the camp seemed almost peaceful. A breeze moved through the barracks, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Someone whispered a joke. Another replied with a soft chuckle. Somewhere faintly, a harmonica played a melody that didn't belong to any side, just to men who had lived too long in noise and blood. For the first time in years, they were not soldiers, not prisoners, not enemies, just men breathing in unison under a foreign sky. And yet in that fragile peace, another fear began to form. If life could exist here, if they could laugh, work, and find rhythm, even behind wire, then what would be left of them? When the gates finally opened, would they still know who they were, or had the war already taken? That too, winter crept in, quietly dusting the camp with frost that sparkled under the pale Texas Sunday. The routines continued: roll call, work meals. But beneath the rhythm, something had begun to shift. The men spoke less. Their laughter came slower, their thoughts heavier. Rumors had started to drift across the compound like smoke, rumors of bombings of cities, burning of a war collapsing faster than anyone could believe. At first, no one dared to say the word defeat. It was poison on the tongue. But it lingered, whispered in the dark between bunks, growing louder with every passing week. One morning, an interpreter read aloud a translated headline from an American newspaper. Tokyo, firebombed, thousands dead. The words dropped into the silence like stones. No one moved. No one breathed. A man at the end of the line clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms, drawing blood he didn't feel. Another simply turned away, his face hollow, staring out beyond the wire, where the sky stretched endlessly blue. That night, letters stopped being written. The camp divided itself in ways no guard could see. On one side were those who accepted the truth, the men who had seen too much to believe in victory anymore. On the other were the faithful, still clinging to the ghost of the empire, to the idea that their suffering meant something greater. They argued in whispers that turned into shouts, words sharp as knives in the cold air. "You dishonor our homeland," one man spat. "You let their kindness corrupt you." The other answered quietly, his voice shaking not from fear but exhaustion. "Kindness is not corruption. It's survival." That line hung between them heavier than any weapon. Days later, the Red Cross arrived again, their white armbands stark against the gray of winter. They spoke with the guards, inspected the kitchens, checked the prisoners' medical records. When they left, one officer handed out envelopes, letters from home. Each man waited his turn, trembling as names were called. For some, there was nothing. For others, the news inside those thin papers shattered what little strength they had left. A man from Nagoya read that his wife and daughter had died in an air raid. He did not cry. He folded the letter neatly, placed it in his breast pocket, and went to work the next morning without a word. By evening he was gone, found hanging behind the barracks, his body swaying in the wind like a shadow that refused to leave. The guards cut him down in silence. No one spoke his name again, but the image stayed burned into their minds. That night arguments flared again. He was a coward, one man said bitterly. No, another replied. He was loyal to the only thing he had left. The room erupted. Words became accusations: traitor, fool, coward, heretic. Someone threw a punch, another shouted for order. The guards burst in, breaking up the fight without brutality, but the damage was done. The barracks had split in two, the fracture now visible. Outside, the world kept collapsing. The Philippines were lost. Okinawa burned. Rumors of new weapons, machines that could destroy a city in seconds, spread like wildfire. The prisoners didn't know if they were lies, but something in their gut told them the end was near. For the first time, they stopped asking when they would be released. The question had changed. What would be left of them when they were? One afternoon, a small group was sent to work on a farm beyond the wire. The farmer, an old man with a limp, glared at them from his porch. His son had died in the Pacific. The hatred in his eyes was raw, personal. When one prisoner stumbled under a heavy sack of grain, the farmer spat on the ground. The guard standing nearby saw it, paused, then bent down and helped the prisoner lift the load back onto his shoulder. No words were spoken. The contrast between the two men, the enemy's hate and the enemy's mercy, cut deep. That night, the prisoner who had fallen couldn't sleep. He replayed the image over and over, one man's disgust, another's compassion. Which of them was the real America? Which one had he fought? The cracks inside them widened. A week later, a shipment of supplies arrived. Boxes stamped with the Red Cross emblem. Inside were clothes, books, and instruments. The guards distributed them with casual efficiency. Among the items was a small wooden cross, part of a donation for the camp chapel. When one of the prisoners picked it up, his hands trembled. Religion had never mattered to him before. War had burned faith out of his bones. But holding that cross, simple and handmade, something inside him stirred. It wasn't belief. It was recognition that even in this place built for captivity, someone, somewhere, still thought mercy mattered. That night, a storm swept through the camp. Rain lashed against the barracks, wind howled through the cracks, and thunder rolled across the sky like artillery. The men lay awake, flinching at every flash of light. One of the younger prisoners whispered into the dark, "When this ends, what will we be?" No one answered, but the silence itself became an answer. They were soldiers without a war, men without a cause. Days passed. Then came the news that shattered whatever illusions remained. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The announcement came over the loudspeaker in halting translation, each word landing like a hammer blow. Some prisoners gasped. Others sat perfectly still. A few fell to their knees, faces in their hands. For years they had believed that dying for the empire was the only honorable path. Now the empire had bowed, and they were still alive. Shame twisted in their chests like a blade. One man whispered, "We are ghosts now." The guards treated them no differently. Meals were served. Work continued. The routine stayed intact, as if nothing had changed. That steadiness, the refusal to gloat, was the final insult and the final mercy. The enemy had won, and yet they offered no triumph, no scorn, only the quiet continuation of order. That evening the men sat in their barracks, the weight of the news pressing down like gravity. A young prisoner, the same one who had once argued that kindness was survival, stood and said softly, "Our emperor told us the enemy had no soul. But look around. Which of us has one now?" No one could meet his eyes. The next morning, when the sun rose over the wire, it glinted off rows of men, standing silently in formation. Their uniforms were clean, their faces blank, but something inside them had shifted forever. They had seen the collapse of everything they were taught to believe. They had seen mercy from the hands of those they were taught to hate. And in that unbearable contradiction, something human had survived. The war outside had ended, but inside the fences a different one raged on, a quiet, merciless war of conscience. And for the first time, none of them knew which side they were on. The morning they were told they would be leaving the camp was silent. Not with celebration, not with relief, but with the kind of stillness that comes when people no longer know what to feel. The war had ended weeks earlier, yet the truth of it had not settled in. Japan had surrendered. The empire that had once promised them glory now lay in ashes. And they, the soldiers who had been ready to die for it, were going home not as heroes but as prisoners. Dawn came gray and cold, a thin mist rolling over the barracks. The men rose without being called. They folded their blankets neatly, swept the floors, packed what little they owned, a photograph, a carved wooden toy, a few letters stained with sweat and tears. Outside trucks idled with engines humming low, their exhaust curling into the morning air. The guards moved quietly among them, checking lists, giving instructions in calm voices. No one shouted. No one laughed. It was as if both sides understood that this was not victory, not loss, but something beyond both. A strange, fragile truce between enemies who had shared too much silence to hate each other anymore. When the gates opened, the men hesitated. For 2 years that fence had been the edge of their world. Beyond it lay freedom, and yet freedom no longer looked the way it had in their dreams. One by one they stepped through boots, crunching on the gravel, the sound echoing like a heartbeat against the wire. Some looked back at the camp, the barracks, the towers, the mess hall, where they had first tasted meat again, and felt something that terrified them: gratitude. Not for captivity, but for the proof that even in war, humanity had not died completely. The journey back across the Pacific was long and haunted. The ship's hold smelled of salt and oil, the air heavy with memories. No one wanted to speak aloud. At night, the men gathered on deck, staring at the endless dark water. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay their homeland, though none knew what remained of it. A few whispered prayers. Others smoked in silence, eyes fixed on the waves. One man pulled from his pocket a bottle cap he had kept since that first day in the mess hall. He turned it over in his hand, the red script half faded, the metal worn smooth. It was nothing, a piece of trash. And yet to him it was everything, a reminder that kindness could come from the unthinkable. When the ship finally docked, the sight that greeted them was not the home they remembered. The port was rubble, the air thick with ash and silence. Families waited on the shore, thin and pale eyes, hollowed by hunger and loss. Mothers searching for sons, children clinging to strangers. The prisoners stepped onto land and felt smaller than they ever had before. Some were met with tears, others with cold stares. "You surrendered," one man heard from his brother. "You lived while others died." He had no answer. Days turned into weeks. They tried to rebuild, but the world no longer fit them. They had carried the enemy's language in their mouths, the enemy's food in their bellies, the enemy's mercy in their memories. That mercy was harder to bear than hatred had ever been. At night, they dreamed of the camp, the quiet, the order, the guards who spoke without cruelty. They woke ashamed of their own longing for the very place that had confined them. One evening, a former prisoner was invited to speak at a small gathering in his village. He stood before a handful of men and women, all survivors in their own way, and tried to explain what he had seen. His voice was unsteady. "They fed us," he said, "every day. Even when their own soldiers were dying, they treated us as men, not beasts. I used to think mercy was weakness, but it wasn't. It was strength. The kind we never learned." The room was silent. A woman began to cry softly, not from grief but from something deeper, recognition. Years passed. The world moved on. The men who had been prisoners aged quietly, their stories fading into the noise of progress. Some never spoke of it again. Others told their children small fragments: the smell of bread, the sound of a guard's laugh, the shock of a cold bottle in their hand. A few kept relics: a spoon, a photograph, a scrap of uniform marked with PW. To anyone else they were worthless. To them they were reminders that war could destroy nations, but not necessarily the soul. One of them, long after the war, returned to America as an old man. The camp was gone, replaced by open fields and quiet trees. He stood where the barracks once were, the wind carrying the faint scent of grass and rain. He closed his eyes and remembered the faces, the guards, the cooks, the men who had once been his enemies and who had somehow saved his humanity. He whispered something to the wind. a prayer, or perhaps an apology, then let the bottle cap fall from his hand into the dirt. The world he had known was gone. But the memory remained sharp as glass, soft as mercy. He had learned that hatred could be taught, but compassion could never be erased once it was seen. It lived in the quiet moments, the way a guard shared a cigarette, the way a medic cleaned a wound, the way men who had been enemies looked at each other and saw, not soldiers, not nations, but humans, trying to survive the madness of their time. As the sun set over the empty field, he turned to leave. Behind him the wind whispered through the grass, carrying echoes of laughter, footsteps, the hum of engines long gone. He did not look back again. Some wars never truly end. They fade into memory, leaving behind the ghosts of what was lost and the fragile hope of what was found. For the men who walked out of that camp, survival was not the victory they expected, it was the lesson they were never meant to learn. War had shown them cruelty, yes, but captivity had shown them something far more dangerous, the power of mercy. And that was the wound they carried for the rest of their lives. Because kindness once given cannot be forgotten. It lingers in the blood, in the silence, in the space between memory and forgiveness. Long after the guns have gone quiet, it remains the proof that even in the darkest chapters of humanity, someone, somewhere, still chose to be kind. War teaches men how to destroy, but captivity taught them how to see. Long after the fences were torn down and the uniforms burned away, what remained was not the memory of victory or defeat, it was the memory of kindness. In that camp, between hunger and humiliation, they had discovered something more powerful than hatred. The simple, disarming truth that mercy can survive even inside war's machinery. The enemy they had been taught to despise had given them food, warmth, and dignity, and in doing so had broken them in a way no weapon could. Years later, as old men with trembling hands and fading eyes, they no longer spoke of battles or medals. They spoke of the first bite of bread, the first clean blanket, the first moment they realized that being treated as human could hurt more than being wounded. Some carried guilt, others carried gratitude. But all carried the same understanding that humanity is not a flag nor a uniform, but a choice. The war ended, yet its echoes lived in every act of compassion they remembered. The greatest power was never in domination or conquest, but in restraint, in the refusal to become the monster the war demanded. History would record the bombs, the numbers, the treaties, but not the quiet moments that redeemed the human spirit inside barbed wire. Those moments belonged only to the men who lived them, and to the memory of what they revealed, that even in the darkest hour, mercy endures. And perhaps that is the real victory, the one that no nation can claim, but every heart can recognize.